welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Yep. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC. Or, as we like to say on the show, UPTV. These views are our own, and by our in this instance, I mean myself, and anyone whose views may leak through the things that I read by way of providing you with information. Capiche? As they say in Italy. So I'm back. Wasn't here last week. For you UPTVers, I'm here every week, but for you radio listeners, I wasn't here last week. I try to spread these out a little bit. The last time we spoke, or I spoke to you, you don't ever speak to me. I was talking about reasons for why people migrate. Why do they go from one place to another? Why, when you're lived someplace your whole life and you have, an entire network of people that you know and places you're familiar with and all that sort of thing, why would you then just go, you know what? Nah, I think I'm just going to pull up stakes, leave all this stuff behind, and go to some new place and start over again from scratch. When you put it like that, it sounds like a pretty big deal. And it, in fact, is a pretty big deal. People don't do this casually. It's not something that somebody just goes, oh, what should I do today? Let's see. I could just relax and watch movies. I could go shopping. I'm kind of behind on my shopping. Oh, you know what? I'm just going to pack up everything and move to another country. They don't do that. And further, to borrow some of the critiques that one hears from the more loudmouth contingent of anti-immigrationists, there is no one that I can imagine in the world who is so lazy that they're like, I'm living here and I have to have a job and I have to do all this stuff. I want to go somewhere where they have public benefits and I can just sponge off the government for the rest of my life. That's what I want to do. And I'll tell you, if there were, I don't believe that there are, but let's say there's somebody who is so lazy, who's so committed to just soaking up public benefits that they're willing to upend their entire life and move to a different country. They're not coming to the U.S. We're not noted for generous public welfare here. I would try some European Union countries, maybe, places that have social welfare systems that are pretty robust, nationalized medicine, if you're going to lay around and relax, you're going to have health issues and you're going to want to go to the doctor and you, of course, don't want to pay for it because you're so lazy you don't want to have a job. You're certainly not coming to the U.S. because there's no way anyone's going to pay for it. They're just going to go, you can't afford it? Suffer, die. That's how it works here. So, that's not happening. But anyway, sorry, I get sidetracked sometimes when I start thinking of some of the things I've heard people say or I've read them saying and realize just how ludicrous they are. When a lot of times when somebody says something kind of all by itself, you just go, there's nothing to really compare it to. It's just sort of sitting there and you go, that sounds kind of weird. But it's the full ridiculousness of a lot of things that people say isn't always clear until you stop and think about them a little bit. You put a little thought into them. And this is one reason that people are able to get away with saying ridiculous things to each other. Part of it's peer pressure. It's like, well, you don't want to like start an argument with your friends. There's somebody that you're having a friendly time with, you're having fun, and then they just say something ridiculous. It's like, well, do I just destroy this good time for the sake of saying, no, actually that's a really racist or bigoted or whatever kind of comment? A lot of us, let's face it, we're just kind of going to go, I'm just going to let this slide. This is not the time to confront this. Not that there ever is a time to confront it, but it never seems, let's just put it this way, it never feels like the right time to confront creepy comments and creepy thinking. It's always easier to think, well, I'll deal with this some other time, when it's a better situation for that sort of thing. And then so we don't do it. But yeah, so, as someone who's, I was going to say gets paid to, I do not get paid to do this. As someone who spends a lot of time commenting on this sort of thing, I am surprised myself regularly at how many notions that I've read about or heard about that I've never really, really, really thought deeply about. And so I just go, oh, well, that's wrong. And then I brush by it. And then if I start and think about it, I think, well, that's so wrong. There's no way you could even imagine that it could be right. And then it's amazing. It's surprising to me that these things are floating around out there, but they are. Sad to say. So anyway, we like I said, last couple of shows we were talking about reasons why people immigrate. There is some actually new news, if I can put it that way. New-ish. I guess it's not like brand spanking new. It's maybe a week or so old, but I thought I would use this as sort of an interesting way to get into this topic again. So we've spoken about this before, and it finally came all the way around and made its way through the courts and such. So now it's a thing again. Before it was a proposal, now it's a thing. So I'll read you something really quickly to describe it. This is entitled, U.S. Supreme Court Lets Hardline Trump Immigration Policy Take Effect. You've probably heard about this, but here we go. The U.S. Supreme Court gave the go-ahead on Monday for one of President Donald Trump's hardline immigration policies, allowing his administration to implement a rule denying legal permanent residency to certain immigrants deemed likely to require government assistance in the future. The justices, on a 5-4 vote, and whenever you hear the words 5-4 vote, that means 5, almost invariably, that will mean the 5 conservative judges versus the 4 more liberal ones. The justices, on a 5-4 vote, granted the administration's request to lift a lower court's injunction that had blocked the so-called public charge policy while litigation over its legality continues. The rule has been criticized by immigrant rights advocates as a wealth test that would disproportionately keep out non-white immigrants. The court's 5 conservative judges, including Chief Justice John Roberts and 2 justices appointed by Trump, carried the day. The court's 4 liberal justices said they would have denied the administration's request. The action was announced even as Roberts sat as the presiding officer in Trump's impeachment trial in the U.S. Senate. Lawsuits aiming to block the policy were filed against the administration by the states of New York, Connecticut, and Vermont, as well as by New York City and several nonprofit organizations. In imposing an injunction blocking it, Manhattan-based U.S. District Judge George Daniels on October 11th called the rule repugnant to the American dream and a policy of exclusion in search of a justification. The administration asked the High Court to let the rule go into effect even before the New York-based Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals rules on Trump's appeal of the injunction. The Second Circuit is considering the matter on an expedited basis, with legal papers to be submitted by February 14th and arguments expected soon afterward. The administration can now enforce the rule nationwide, except in Illinois. Thank you, Illinois, where a lower court has blocked its implementation. Ken Cuccinelli, acting deputy secretary at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, praised the high court. Quote, "It is very clear the U.S. Supreme Court is fed up with these national injunctions by judges who are trying to impose their policy preferences instead of enforcing the law," he told reporters. At issue is which immigrants will be granted legal permanent residency, known as a green card. Under Trump's policy, immigration officers would consider factors such as age, educational level, and English proficiency to decide whether an immigrant would likely become a public charge who would receive government benefits such as the Medicaid health insurance program for the poor. The administration has said the new rule is necessary to better ensure that immigrants will be self-sufficient. Critics have said the rule would disproportionately bar low-income people from developing countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia from permanent residency. Limiting legal immigration based on an applicant's wealth is shameful and entirely un-American, Democratic Senator Dick Durbin wrote on Twitter. A spokesman for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the agency that processes visa applications, said it would determine the most appropriate method to implement the public charge rule and would release additional information soon. Trump has made his tough immigration stance a hallmark of his presidency and 2020 re-election campaign. U.S. immigration law has long required officials to exclude people likely to become a public charge from permanent residency. U.S. guidelines in place for the past 2 decades had said immigrants likely to become primarily dependent on direct cash assistance or long-term institutionalization in a nursing home, for example, at public expense would be barred. The new rule expands the public charge bar to anyone deemed likely to receive a much wider range of public benefits for more than an aggregate of 12 months over any 36-month period, including health care, housing, and food assistance. The vast majority of people seeking permanent residency are not eligible for public benefits themselves. A 2019 Urban Institute survey found that the administration's rule was already deterring people from seeking benefits for U.S. citizen children for fear of harming their own future immigration status. Benefits for family members are not considered under the rule. Claudia Center, a lawyer with the American Civil Liberties Union, said the rule targets disabled people applying for green cards and enshrines the false stereotype that people with disabilities do not contribute to our society. The High Court could give Trump more victories on immigration policy. The conservative justices signaled support in November for Trump's bid to kill a program that protects hundreds of thousands of immigrants, dubbed Dreamers, who entered the United States illegally as children. A ruling is due by the end of June. The court in 2018 upheld Trump's travel ban targeting people from several Muslim-majority countries. Conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee who voted to lift the injunction, issued an opinion criticizing lower courts' increasingly common use of nationwide injunctions to halt government policies. Gorsuch urged the court to confront the issue. "What in this gamesmanship and chaos can we be proud of?" Gorsuch asked. 2 other federal appeals courts previously lifted nationwide injunctions ordered by lower courts blocking the rule. Okay, so that's what's happened. The public charge rule has, at least for the moment, gone into effect. Now, it can still be deemed unconstitutional or something, but all they didn't say, yes, it's fine. They said, yes, it can go ahead until it makes its way through the courts, which is not entirely the same thing. So, I mean, for those who are reading the tea leaves of this, so to speak, it does imply that they at least think it's got a good chance of going through, but that's likely the case. I mean, but it is worth saying that some justices, including Gorsuch in particular, have written about this notion of lower courts doing nationwide injunctions on things, and that's something they don't like. So this also could be a reaction to that as much as an endorsement of the policy. So it remains to be seen. We won't say that it's absolutely horrible bad news, but it probably is, because these guys certainly don't seem to care much about how bigoted or racist the reasoning behind these policies are, like the travel ban, for example. They only seem to care about whether or not it is legal to do so, to make this kind of thing. So it's tricky terrain. Sorry. It's so dry in here. It's amazing. I can't even believe it. Anyway, so moving on, let's take a look at, we did this story before, but I think it bears repeating in this instance, about how this rule, this public charge rule, has been used in the past. And this is entitled "The Troubling History of How America's Public Charge Immigration Rule Blocked Jews Fleeing Nazi Germany." So Congress had long ago established annual immigration quotas that discriminated against certain national origins. But the White House officials considered even those quotas to be too generous. They brandished an obscure provision of immigration law that excluded visa applicants likely to become public charges. A new and stricter interpretation of the public charge provision could effectively reduce the quotas by as much as 90%. Advocates for immigration denounced the move as bad policy and as an overreach of executive authority, but most Americans seemed too preoccupied with their own problems to demand a change. The president who announced this policy was not Donald Trump, but Herbert Hoover in 1930, after the start of the Great Depression. And as an editorial aside, at least there you can kind of see a linking of the notion of a public charge to current events that were going on, where people could say, oh, well, I feel that a country that is in a deep depression and can't afford to pay anything and nobody has any jobs, certainly doesn't want other people coming here and adding to the problem. So, it's at least has some basis in the reality of the time, why they may have made this decision. Anyway, Hitler would come to power less than 3 years later. Raymond Geist, the U.S. consul in Berlin charged with applying immigration policy in Germany during much of the 1930s, saw firsthand the destruction the policy caused. The Nazis prohibited most German Jews from taking substantial assets out of the country, which meant that they would be potential public charges unless they had close relatives in the U.S. with ample resources. As a result, American consuls rejected the application of tens of thousands of people who could have made fine American citizens, thus trapping them in an escalating Nazi persecution. In 1933, in the first term of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, his administration considered changing the public charge clause to allow for the entry of more refugees from Germany. At the time, the United States did not distinguish between immigrants and refugees, nor was there any such thing as political asylum. But immigration was a sensitive issue with the public and Congress, and Jewish immigration particularly so. Some of Roosevelt's critics called the New Deal the Jew Deal. There were State Department officials who thought American Jewish protests against Nazi persecution were exaggerated and artificial, part of a Jewish scheme to ease American barriers to increased immigration. Responding to criticism from liberal forces inside and outside the administration, in July 1933, the State Department instructed consuls abroad that they should deny visas only to individuals who would probably become public charges. But it also signaled that they should still keep immigration down, and over the next year the total from Germany rose only slightly. More than 80% of the German quota remained unused. But on the ground in Germany, as I learned while researching my book, The Berlin Mission, American consul Raymond Geist tried at times to loosen these constraints. He made it known that American families could adopt German Jewish children, thus ensuring that these families' resources would keep such rescued children from becoming public burdens. Geist himself shepherded a program that by 1938 had brought approximately 350 German Jewish children to the U.S. When the U.S. economy began to recover from the Depression, Geist suggested that visa applicants who were on an inactive waiting list should be notified that they could now formally apply for immigration visas. Though most of them would have been able to obtain jobs in America, the State Department rejected his suggestion. Geist also quietly worked with David Glick, an emissary of the Warburg family and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, to increase German Jewish emigration to the U.S. and other countries. After FDR's 1936 re-election landslide, officials in Washington did recalibrate immigration policy. After making it known that some consuls had been too strict in their use of the public charge, in January 1937, Geist's former boss and patron George Messersmith, now promoted to Assistant Secretary of State, wrote a new visa instruction to consuls in Europe telling them they should not reject applicants based on the mere possibility that they might become public charges. The State Department now took a more generous view of German Jewish applicants for visas, some of whom had affidavits of financial support from distant relatives or friends in the U.S. The result was a sudden increase in immigration from Germany to about 50% of the quota. By the middle of 1938, the monthly quotas were filled. But by that time, Nazi Germany had absorbed Austria and much of what had been Czechoslovakia, creating an enormous refugee crisis. The once substantial annual quota for German immigrants of 27,370, Germany plus Austria, now seemed paltry, given a waiting list of several 100,000 visa applicants, the vast majority of whom were Jews. The public charge provision was no longer the main obstacle to their immigration. The quota limit was. Congress and the American public were in no mood to breach the quotas. A November 1938 poll taken immediately after Kristallnacht showed that 71% of the Americans opposed the entrance into their country of a larger number of German exiles, while only 21% supported it. A few months later, 66% of a sample opposed bringing 10,000 refugee children to the U.S. beyond what was permitted by the quota. Only 26% supported it. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum today displays this polling data in its impressive Americans and the Holocaust exhibition. Given these attitudes toward immigration, a bill that would allow 10,000 children from Germany into the U.S. outside the quota for 2 successive years went nowhere in Congress. Eleanor Roosevelt supported it, but in vain. The nearly full use of the German-Austrian immigration quota lasted for roughly 2 years. In mid-1940, a new obstacle arose. After rapid German conquest of France, pervasive concerns about American security fostered a fearful and resentful climate of opinion. Roger Poll, in June 1940, found that only 2.7% of Americans thought the government was doing enough to counteract a Nazi fifth column operating in the U.S. German Jews were not immune from those suspicions. Some Americans thought Jews could be coerced into spying for Germany based on threats to their relatives in Germany. Others, including a former Undersecretary of State, thought that inherent Jewish greed might lead refugees and immigrants to work for the Nazi cause. By mid-1941, the State Department instructed consuls to deny visas to applicants who had relatives living in the totalitarian countries of Germany, the Soviet Union, and Italy. And then Congress passed a bill directing consuls abroad to refuse a visa to any alien who might endanger public safety. The quotas once again went unfulfilled. Nazi Germany dealt unilaterally with its imagined worldwide Jewish conspiracy through mass executions and deportations to ghettos and extermination camps. From October 1941 on, it formally blocked the legal emigration of Jews from its territories, and it called on allies and satellite countries to turn over their Jews. Most German Jews who made it through the difficult security screening in the U.S. came from neutral countries. Only in January 1944 did the Roosevelt administration, responding to some criticism and internal pressure, change course again, establishing a war refugee board to try to save the lives of civilian victims of Nazi persecution. The board helped tens of thousands of Jews survive in Europe in the last 16 months of the war. During this entire tragic period, the basic immigration laws and national origin quotas never changed, but the actual level of immigration fluctuated greatly. The belated recognition that the United States might have done more to save the lives of Jews and other victims of Nazi persecution before and during the Holocaust contributed to the passage of the National Refugee Act in 1980, giving refugees a special status within U.S. immigration limits. Now the Trump administration seems to be reconsidering that idea and showing once again just how much the executive branch can reduce immigration without having to go through Congress. The same vague language in the public charge clause that allowed Hoover to cut quotas by some 90% and that allowed some State Department officials in Roosevelt's first term to maintain that the German quota was unfilled because of lack of qualified applicants, was set to be put to new use earlier this month. Federal judges on October 11th blocked a planned Trump administration expansion of the use of the public charge provision, but other rules in the same vein are still set to take effect. In his defense of the blocked policy, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Acting Director Ken Cuccinelli made the point that the public charge regulation was a long-held existing law. Few people remember that in early 1937, State Department officials gave out, and Geis helped to apply, a reasonable interpretation of the public charge clause. Consuls could not reject applicants who might possibly become public charges, only those who would probably become public charges. So I thought this was worth reading again because it's reminds us of how these kinds of rules have been used in the past, I would say misused, and how they are being used in the exact same way by bigots and racists and what have you, to exclude people simply based on spurious reasoning, like just this notion like, well, I think you're probably not going to really make much money in the future, so I'm sorry, you can't come in. And that's going on today. So I can hear it now before I even continue. I can hear somebody thinking this, even if they're not saying it, but I can hear them thinking it. It's like, well, but this is not World War II. We're not talking about the Holocaust in Germany and all this stuff. So it's not fair. It's not a fair comparison. Okay, I've already thought of this. I've thought of this argument, and so I have something here from UNICEF entitled "Why Migrants Flee Central America." So you say this is not Germany, there's no Holocaust going on. Well, let's see, what are the conditions south of the border